The afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over Oakwood Park, making the playground shimmer with life. Laughter echoed as children chased each other, their voices blending with the gentle rustling of leaves. Amid the laughter, an 8-year-old girl named Emma played alone, content with the delicate game she had made for herself. Her blonde curls bounced as she jumped from rock to rock, pretending to hop across an imaginary river. But as Emma played, she felt a strange chill run down her spine, like someone was watching her. She turned her head slightly and noticed a man standing by a tree, not too far away. His gaze was fixed on her, dark and unblinking, and he wore a small, unsettling smile that sent shivers down her spine. He didn't seem like the kind of person who would belong in a park full of children. Emma's heartbeat quickened. She wasn't sure what to do. Her parents had always told her to stay away from strangers, but she had never imagined she'd be in a situation like this. Her mind raced, searching for an escape. Then she spotted her chance, a woman with kind, gentle eyes, sitting on a bench near the path, feeding birds from a small paper bag. Her gray hair was tied back in a bun, and her face held the warmth of a grandmother's smile. Emma took a deep breath and walked over to the woman, her heart pounding as she got closer. She didn't know what she was going to say, but something told her this woman would help her. Taking another brave step forward, she whispered, "Excuse me, could you pretend you know me? There's a man following me." The woman's face softened with understanding, and she opened her arms as if greeting an old friend. "Emma, my dear," she said warmly, her voice carrying just the right note of surprise and affection. "I've been waiting for you." Emma leaned into the woman's embrace, feeling the warmth and safety in her touch. She whispered her name quickly, just loud enough for the woman to hear. The woman, now her protector, smiled gently. "Oh, Emma, I've missed you so much," she said, playing along without missing a beat. She placed an arm around Emma's shoulders, holding her close as if they were family. In the corner of her eye, Emma saw the man shift uncomfortably, watching them from a distance, clearly hesitant to approach now that she was with someone. The woman took out her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she called the police, all while continuing her friendly chatter with Emma. "Tell me all about school, darling," she said, her tone light and cheerful. But Emma could feel the woman's grip tighten protectively around her shoulders. Emma felt her pulse begin to slow, her fear melting into relief. It's good," she stammered, trying to keep up with the act. A few minutes later, 2 police officers appeared at the park entrance, their blue uniforms standing out against the vibrant green of the trees. The woman gently turned Emma toward them. "Look, dear. The police are here. They're our friends, and they'll make sure everything's okay." As the officers approached, the man began to back away. But it was too late. The police had already spotted him, and one of them called out, "Sir, please stop right there." The man hesitated, his gaze darting from Emma and the elderly woman to the officers. Then, in a swift, panicked movement, he turned and ran. The police officers sprang into action, chasing after him down the path. Emma clung to the woman, her heart pounding again, but this time with relief instead of fear. She knew she was safe now. When the officers returned, one of them knelt down beside Emma and the woman, his expression kind. "You did the right thing by finding someone to help you," he said gently to Emma. "And ma'am, thank you for acting so quickly. You may have saved her life." The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Gracefield, smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of relief and pride. "I just did what anyone would do," she said softly. But as she looked down at Emma, she felt something stirring inside her, a spark of purpose she hadn't felt in years. In that moment, Emma realized she hadn't just found someone to help her. She had found a friend, maybe even a hero. The events of the park lingered in Mrs. Gracefield's mind long after the police had taken the man away and the sun began to dip below the treetops. As she walked Emma toward the park entrance to meet her family, she felt an unexplainable connection with the little girl beside her. It wasn't just a sense of responsibility, it was something deeper. Almost like finding a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. Just as they reached the gate, Emma's mother and father came rushing forward. Their faces filled with panic that melted into relief when they saw her safe and unharmed. Her mother knelt down, pulling Emma into a tight embrace, brushing her hair back as she murmured, "Oh, Emma. Are you all right? We were so worried." Emma nodded, looking back at Mrs. Gracefield with a shy smile. "I'm okay, Mom. Mrs. Gracefield helped me." Her father, standing beside them, reached out a hand to Mrs. Gracefield. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what we would have done if anything had happened to her. Thank you for being there." Mrs. Gracefield took his hand, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "There's no need to thank me. I'm just glad I was able to help." She gave Emma's hand a reassuring squeeze. "She's a brave little girl." Emma's mother stood, her eyes brimming with tears. We hadn't realized how serious it was until we saw the police. Emma tried to tell us she'd been scared of strangers lately. But I suppose we thought she was imagining things. This is a wake-up call." Emma's father nodded in agreement, his expression troubled. "We'll listen more carefully from now on. Sweetheart," he said softly to Emma. "We're so proud of you." Emma smiled, though a hint of worry lingered in her eyes. "Mom. Dad, can we see Mrs. Gracefield again? She was really brave too." Mrs. Gracefield felt her heart swell. She hadn't been called brave in a long time. Her life had grown quiet, her days blending into one another with little change. The neighborhood children played around her, but none ever really spoke to her. She'd become part of the park scenery, invisible yet always there. Emma's mother placed a hand on Mrs. Gracefield's shoulder. "If you wouldn't mind, we'd love for you to come over sometime," she said sincerely. "I think Emma could use a friend like you. And, frankly, so could we." A warmth like sunlight flooded Mrs. Gracefield's heart. She found herself nodding before she even had time to think. "I'd love that," she replied, a gentle smile touching her lips. They exchanged numbers. And after a final hug from Emma, Mrs. Gracefield watched the family walk away, their forms gradually disappearing into the distance. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the emptiness that often crept in when she was left alone. She felt hopeful. Over the next few days, Mrs. Gracefield found herself thinking about Emma and her family constantly. She wondered how Emma was doing, whether she felt safe again, and if her family had fully realized just how brave their daughter had been. A few days later, as she sat in her small, cozy apartment, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Emma's mother, inviting her over for tea. Mrs. Gracefield's heart leaped. She quickly replied, accepting the invitation, and spent the next hour bustling around her apartment, picking out a scarf and carefully wrapping a small gift for Emma, a delicate charm bracelet she had made herself years ago and had kept as a reminder of her own daughter. When Mrs. Gracefield arrived at Emma's house, she was welcomed warmly. Emma ran to the door to greet her, her face lighting up as she saw Mrs. Gracefield standing there with a shy smile. "Mrs. Gracefield," she cried, throwing her arms around her. Mrs. Gracefield hugged her tightly. feeling the same sense of purpose surge within her. "Hello, dear Emma," she said warmly, smoothing down the girl's hair. "I brought something for you." Emma's eyes widened with excitement as Mrs. Gracefield presented her with the bracelet. It was silver with tiny charms, a heart, a star, a butterfly. "It's beautiful," Emma gasped, slipping it onto her wrist. "Thank you, Mrs. Gracefield. I love it." Emma's mother appeared, a grateful smile on her face as she invited Mrs. Gracefield to sit down. They chatted over tea and cookies, Emma eagerly sharing stories of her latest adventures at school. Mrs. Gracefield listened intently, laughing and nodding as Emma spoke, feeling as if she were part of the family. It was the happiest she'd felt in years. As they talked, Emma's father joined them, and the conversation took a more serious turn. "We've been thinking about what happened in the park, Mrs. Gracefield," he said quietly. "Emma's told us more about that day, and we can't thank you enough for being there. We want you to know you've become very important to our family." Emma nodded enthusiastically, reaching over to hold Mrs. Gracefield's hand. "You're my hero," she said earnestly, looking up at her with admiration. Tears pricked at Mrs. Gracefield's eyes. She had never expected such kindness, such love from this family. "Thank you, Emma," she whispered, feeling her voice shake. "You've given me more than you know." That evening, as she walked home, Mrs. Gracefield felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer just a stranger in the park. She was part of a family that cared for her, appreciated her, and made her feel valued. And, perhaps most importantly, she had a friend, a little girl who saw her as a hero. As the days turned into weeks, Mrs. Gracefield's life seemed brighter and more purposeful than it had in a long time. Her walks in the park now had a renewed sense of anticipation, as Emma often joined her, accompanied by her mother or father. The little girl had become her most faithful companion, and they shared stories, jokes, and dreams as they strolled through the paths lined with autumn leaves. One crisp morning, as they walked together along the park's winding paths, Emma looked up at Mrs. Gracefield with a thoughtful expression. "Mrs. Gracefield, do you think you could come to my school one day?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Mrs. Gracefield chuckled, her heart warmed by the idea. "Oh, Emma, I'd love that. But I wouldn't want to embarrass you in front of your friends." Emma shook her head eagerly. "No, you wouldn't. My friends would love you. I told them about the park, about how brave you were. And they all want to meet you. And maybe," Emma's voice softened, her eyes drifting down to her feet, "maybe you could help us with our class project." Mrs. Gracefield was touched by the invitation. "What kind of project are you working on, dear?" "We're learning about community heroes," Emma explained, her cheeks flushing with excitement. "And I told my teacher that you're my hero, Mrs. Gracefield." Mrs. Gracefield felt her heart swell with pride. She had never thought of herself as a hero, but hearing Emma say it made her feel stronger and braver than she had in years. "I would be honored, Emma," she said gently, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "I'd be happy to come to your school and help with your project." A week later, Mrs. Gracefield found herself standing outside Emma's classroom, her heart fluttering with nerves. She had dressed in her best clothes, and she carried a small basket of homemade cookies, hoping to make a good impression. When Emma's teacher, Ms. Klein, welcomed her into the classroom, all eyes turned toward Mrs. Gracefield. She could feel their curiosity, their interest, and she suddenly felt the weight of her role as the hero Emma had described. But then she caught sight of Emma, sitting in the front row with a proud smile on her face. And her nerves began to fade. "Class. This is Mrs. Gracefield," Ms. Klein announced. "Emma has told us about how she helped her in the park. And today she's here to tell us about her experience and what it means to be brave." Mrs. Gracefield smiled warmly, looking around at the eager faces. She cleared her throat and began. "I'm so grateful to be here with all of you today. Emma is a very special girl. And I'm honored to be her friend." She shared the story of what had happened that day in the park, explaining how important it is to trust your instincts and to find someone you can turn to when you're afraid. The children listened intently, their eyes wide with admiration. "But," she added, looking directly at Emma, "I think the real hero that day was Emma. She was so brave to come to me and ask for help. It's not easy to reach out to someone when you're scared. Emma showed courage. And that's something we can all learn from." Emma beamed, and the class erupted into applause. Mrs. Gracefield felt a surge of pride and gratitude. She had not only been able to help Emma, but she had also been given a chance to inspire others. As the visit came to an end, Ms. Klein approached Mrs. Gracefield with a grateful smile. "You've made such an impact today, Mrs. Gracefield. The children are inspired by your kindness and courage. We'd love to have you come back and speak to other classes if you're interested." Mrs. Gracefield's heart swelled with a newfound purpose. "I'd be delighted to," she replied, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. Following her visit to Emma's school, Mrs. Gracefield found herself increasingly involved in the community. Parents began to approach her in the park, thanking her for what she had done for Emma and expressing their admiration for her courage. Children greeted her with excitement, some even calling her Mrs. Hero. One afternoon, as she was walking through the neighborhood, she saw a notice posted on the community board, "Volunteers needed for the after-school program." She stared at it for a moment, considering it. She had spent so much of her life quietly, keeping to herself. But now she felt ready for something more. The next day, she signed up to volunteer. The after-school program welcomed her warmly. And before long, she found herself teaching arts and crafts, reading stories, and leading small games for the neighborhood children. The laughter and energy of the children filled her with joy, and she felt the years melt away. As she became more involved, she met new friends in the community, people who shared her passion for helping others. She discovered a community garden initiative, where she began teaching the children how to grow flowers and vegetables, finding joy in watching them learn and grow. Emma often visited the garden with her family, and together, they spent hours planting, laughing, and sharing stories. Through these simple, everyday moments, Mrs. Gracefield felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. Months passed, and Mrs. Gracefield's role in the community grew. Her kindness, warmth, and bravery had left a lasting impact, not only on Emma but on the entire neighborhood. She had become a symbol of strength and compassion, a friend to all, and a reminder of the power of one small act of kindness. One day, as she sat in the garden with Emma, watching the flowers they had planted together bloom, Emma looked up at her and asked, "Mrs. Gracefield, do you think everyone can be a hero?" Mrs. Gracefield smiled, wrapping an arm around Emma's shoulders. "Yes, dear. I do. I think a hero is simply someone who cares. Someone who is willing to help when others need it." Emma nodded thoughtfully, her eyes shining with understanding. "Then I want to be a hero, too. Just like you." Mrs. Gracefield's heart swelled with pride. She knew that Emma would grow up to be kind, courageous, and compassionate, just as she was now. And she knew that In her own small way, she had helped plant the seeds of that strength. As they sat together in the garden, surrounded by the beauty they had created, Mrs. Gracefield felt a profound sense of peace. She had found her purpose, her place, and her legacy, in the heart of a little girl named Emma and in the community she had come to love. Months passed, and the bond between Emma and Mrs. Gracefield deepened. They spent afternoons together in the park, tended to their beloved garden, and even began hosting small storytelling sessions for the local children. Mrs. Gracefield had found a renewed sense of belonging, a reason to wake up each day with purpose and joy. One chilly autumn afternoon, as they were preparing the garden for winter, Mrs. Gracefield noticed a familiar face in the distance. She squinted, trying to place the man walking toward them with a hesitant but hopeful expression. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized who it was. "Emma," she murmured, her voice trembling. I think I know that man." Emma looked up, curious. "Who is he?" Mrs. Gracefield took a shaky breath. That's my son, Peter." The words felt strange on her tongue. It had been years since she'd seen Peter. They'd become estranged over a painful misunderstanding that neither of them had been able to bridge. But now, here he was, standing before her, his eyes filled with emotion. Peter walked closer, his face softened by age and remorse. He looked at his mother with a tentative smile. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've missed you." Mrs. Gracefield's hands trembled, but she managed a small, hesitant smile. "Peter, it's been a long time." Emma watched the exchange, sensing the tension but also the love beneath it. She stepped back a little, giving them space, yet staying close enough to offer her quiet support. "I heard about what you did for that little girl," Peter continued, his voice breaking. "Emma, right?" He looked over at Emma and gave her a gentle nod. "I heard you saved her, that you became a hero in this community. I wanted to see for myself. I wanted to see you." Mrs. Gracefield's heart softened as she listened to her son's words. She hadn't expected this, a reunion, an acknowledgement. After so many years of silence, her eyes filled with tears. "Peter, I missed you too. I'm sorry for the years we lost." Peter took a step forward, his gaze softening. "No, Mom. I'm the one who's sorry. I let pride keep me away. I let our misunderstandings grow into walls. I should have come sooner." Emma watched them, her heart swelling with hope. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, speaking in a gentle voice. "Mrs. Gracefield is the best friend anyone could have. She's brave and kind and always looks out for others. I'm really lucky to have her in my life." Mrs. Gracefield smiled through her tears, feeling Emma's words like a warm embrace. She held out a hand to Peter, a gesture of reconciliation. "Peter, it's never too late to mend what's been broken. You're always welcome in my life. In my heart." Peter reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. The years of estrangement, the pain, and the misunderstanding seemed to dissolve in that moment, replaced by a quiet understanding and a shared desire to heal. As the days passed, Peter became a regular visitor, joining his mother and Emma in the garden and even lending a hand with the community projects that Mrs. Gracefield had become so passionate about. Slowly, he found himself a part of this small community, welcomed with open arms by the children and parents who had come to know and love his mother. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Emma looked up at Mrs. Gracefield and Peter, her voice soft and filled with hope. "It feels like a real family now, doesn't it?" Mrs. Gracefield and Peter shared a smile, each recognizing the truth in Emma's words. They had both gained something precious. Mrs. Gracefield had regained her son, and Peter had rediscovered a mother he'd nearly lost. They had also found a kind of family in the neighborhood, a community that embraced them, scars and all. Peter reached over and placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder. "You know, Mom, I'm proud of you. You didn't just save Emma that day in the park, you became a light for so many people here." Mrs. Gracefield's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "Thank you, Peter. But I think Emma saved me, too." Emma beamed, her smile lighting up the gathering dusk. "Maybe we saved each other." As the seasons changed, Mrs. Gracefield's legacy of kindness and courage continued to spread throughout the community. She and Peter continued to volunteer, bringing joy and comfort to those around them. They became a team, mother and son, working together to make their neighborhood a better place. And through it all, Emma remained a beloved friend, a constant presence, a reminder of the courage it took to reach out, to trust, and to love. She became like family to them, visiting Mrs. Gracefield and Peter often, her laughter filling their home and her heart full of the love they shared. In time, the small park where Mrs. Gracefield had once saved Emma became a place of gathering, where families would meet, children would play, and people would share stories of kindness and bravery. Mrs. Gracefield's impact was felt in every corner, a reminder that one act of compassion could create ripples that touched countless lives. And, as the years passed, Emma carried with her the lessons Mrs. Gracefield had taught her. She grew up knowing that courage could be found in quiet moments, that kindness could bridge any distance, and that true heroes were often those who showed up when they were needed the most. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm for Mrs. Gracefield, Emma, and Peter. With each passing week, they grew closer, their lives intertwining in ways none of them had anticipated. Mrs. Gracefield often marveled at how one single act of bravery had led to the reunion with her son and brought a newfound sense of family with Emma. One day, Emma's school sent out an announcement for a Community Heroes event. The principal invited local heroes to share their stories with the students, hoping to inspire a new generation to care for and support each other. When Emma heard about the event, she immediately thought of Mrs. Gracefield. "Will you come, Mrs. Gracefield?" Emma asked eagerly as they sat in the garden one afternoon. "You could tell everyone about that day in the park." Mrs. Gracefield smiled, her heart warmed by Emma's excitement. "I'd be honored, dear," she replied. "If my story can help even one child feel a little braver, then it's worth sharing." Peter, who had been listening nearby, chimed in. "Mom, I'll come too. I think it's time people know the full story, the story of how you've brought so much light to this community." The day of the Community Heroes event arrived, and the school auditorium was packed with students, parents, and teachers. Children fidgeted in their seats, whispering to one another as they waited for the event to begin. Mrs. Gracefield, dressed in her best, stood at the edge of the stage with Peter by her side. She felt a flutter of nerves, but Emma's encouraging smile from the audience reassured her. The principal welcomed everyone, then invited Mrs. Gracefield to the stage, introducing her as a true hero and a beloved member of the community. As she stepped up to the microphone, Mrs. Gracefield took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room filled with eager, attentive faces. "Hello, everyone," she began, her voice steady yet soft. "Today, I'm here to share a story. But this isn't just a story about bravery. It's a story about kindness, trust, and the bonds we create when we open our hearts to others." She recounted the events of that day in the park, describing how a little girl named Emma had come to her for help and how, in that moment, she found the courage to protect her. As she spoke, she felt a surge of pride, not just for herself, but for Emma, who had shown such strength in trusting her. But there's more to the story, she continued, glancing at Peter with a soft smile. Helping Emma that day didn't just save her, it saved me, too. It led me to reconnect with my son, Peter, who I had been separated from for many years. Peter stepped forward, taking his mother's hand. What my mother won't tell you, he said, his voice filled with emotion, is that she's always been a hero. Even when she didn't know it. She's brought light to so many lives, mine included. And she's shown me that it's never too late to make things right. The audience was silent, moved by their story. Emma's classmates looked at her with awe, whispering among themselves. Mrs. Gracefield noticed tears in the eyes of some parents and teachers, and she felt the weight of their admiration. As Mrs. Gracefield and Peter stepped off the stage, the principal took the microphone again, a smile of admiration on his face. Thank you, Mrs. Gracefield and Peter, for sharing your powerful story, he said. Today, we have a special recognition for Mrs. Gracefield. She may not call herself a hero, but in the eyes of this community, she's shown us all what it means to be one. To Mrs. Gracefield's astonishment, the principal held up a plaque with her name on it, titled Heart of the Community. He invited her back on stage, where he presented her with the award, thanking her for her courage, compassion, and for inspiring so many. Tears filled Mrs. Gracefield's eyes as she accepted the plaque, and she turned to the audience, her heart full. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I am deeply humbled by this honor. And I want you all to know that each of you has the potential to be a hero. All it takes is a kind heart and the courage to be there for one another. Emma ran up to the stage, giving Mrs. Gracefield a tight hug, and the audience erupted into applause. Parents, teachers, and students all rose to their feet, clapping and cheering for the woman who had become a symbol of compassion and strength in their community. The story of Mrs. Gracefield's bravery soon spread beyond the school, inspiring others in the community to reach out, offer help, and look out for one another. Neighborhood groups began forming to check in on elderly residents. After-school programs gained more volunteers, and acts of kindness became a common sight. Peter, moved by his mother's impact, decided to start a mentorship program for young people in the community. Drawing from his own experiences, he aimed to support children who, like Emma, needed someone to guide and encourage them. Mrs. Gracefield joined him in this work, offering advice, encouragement, and a warm smile to everyone they met. Emma continued to be a part of their lives, spending weekends with Mrs. Gracefield and Peter, her laughter and boundless energy bringing them both joy. Inspired by her friend's courage, she even took on a small role in helping younger children at her school, teaching them about kindness and bravery. Years passed, and the story of Mrs. Gracefield's heroism remained a beloved tale in the community, a reminder of the power of connection and the ripple effect of kindness. Emma grew older, carrying with her the lessons she had learned from Mrs. Gracefield. She often found herself recounting the story of that fateful day in the park, sharing the wisdom and strength she had gained from her friend. As for Mrs. Gracefield, she spent her days surrounded by love, friendship, and purpose, grateful for the second chance she had been given. She watched Emma grow, proud of the compassionate young woman she was becoming. And she felt peace knowing that her legacy of kindness would live on through those she had touched. One autumn day, as she sat in the park where it had all begun, Mrs. Gracefield closed her eyes, a soft smile gracing her face. She felt the cool breeze and the warmth of the sun. And she knew that her life had been one of meaning, connection, and love. She had found her place, her purpose, and her family, and she knew that her story would continue to inspire long after she was gone. Years slipped by, and Emma grew into a competent young woman, carrying with her the lessons she had learned from Mrs. Gracefield and Peter. She often visited the park where their story had begun, now a place filled with memories of laughter, courage, and kindness. It had become a sanctuary, a place where people gathered to celebrate the spirit of community that Mrs. Gracefield had sparked all those years ago. One spring day, Emma decided to honor Mrs. Gracefield's legacy in a special way. She gathered with her parents, Peter, and a group of friends and neighbors who had been touched by Mrs. Gracefield's warmth and compassion. Together, they planned a small ceremony to dedicate a memorial bench in her name, a place where anyone could come, sit, and remember the power of one person's kindness. The day of the dedication was filled with sunlight and blooming flowers. People from all over the neighborhood gathered in the park, sharing stories of how Mrs. Gracefield had touched their lives. Parents spoke of her influence on their children. Elderly residents shared how she had brightened their days. And young people remembered her encouragement and gentle wisdom. Emma took a deep breath as she approached the bench, a bouquet of daisies in her hand, Mrs. Gracefield's favorite flowers. As she looked at the plaque that read, "In loving memory of Mrs. Gracefield, a heart that touched many lives," a warm smile spread across her face. She turned to the crowd, her voice steady and clear. "Mrs. Gracefield taught us that courage doesn't always come from big actions. Sometimes it's found in small, quiet moments, in lending a hand, in showing up, and in being there for others. She showed me that kindness is a gift we can all give, and that the impact of one good deed can reach further than we can imagine." Peter, standing beside Emma, placed a hand on her shoulder. His eyes shone with pride and gratitude. "My mother didn't see herself as a hero, but she was. She believed in the power of small acts of kindness, and she lived her life with that belief every day. We honor her not only with this bench, but by carrying her legacy forward." As the ceremony concluded, people took turns sitting on the bench, sharing memories, and reflecting on the ways Mrs. Gracefield had inspired them. Emma stayed a little longer, watching the children play nearby, her heart filled with a mix of joy and nostalgia. She felt as though Mrs. Gracefield was right there beside her, still guiding her, still teaching her to be brave and compassionate. The years continued to pass, but Mrs. Gracefield's influence never faded. Her legacy lived on through Emma, who dedicated her life to helping others. Inspired by Mrs. Gracefield's kindness, Emma became a community leader, organizing events and programs to support children, families, and the elderly. She started a foundation in Mrs. Gracefield's name, one that focused on empowering people to make a difference in their communities. Peter continued his work as a mentor, supporting young people who needed guidance and compassion. He and Emma stayed close, bound by their shared love for Mrs. Gracefield and the values she had instilled in them. Together, they made sure that her memory remained a beacon of hope for everyone in the neighborhood. The bench in the park became a beloved spot for generations to come. Families would gather there, telling their children about the remarkable woman who had once saved a little girl and, in turn, changed an entire community. The flowers Emma had planted around the bench bloomed brightly every spring, a testament to the resilience and beauty of Mrs. Gracefield's spirit. And every year, on the anniversary of that fateful day in the park, Emma would return to the bench, bringing a bouquet of daisies. She would sit quietly, reflecting on how one person's kindness had transformed her life. And she'd whisper a quiet thank you to the woman who had taught her that even the smallest acts of compassion could change the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma would leave the park, her heart full, knowing that Mrs. Gracefield's legacy would live on in every act of kindness, in every helping hand, and in every heart that dared to believe in the power of love and compassion. Thank you for listening to the story. Please like and follow the channel to update the next stories.